Hello and welcome to a very special episode series of Unspun live with me, political correspondent Hannah Brown. It's special because we are at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe with a series of events with prominent figures in Scottish politics. I'm just back from interviewing Professor Sir John Curtice, one of the UK's top pollsters, and also from a sit-down chat we spoke with Kevin McKenna, award-winning writer and Herald columnist. Some pretty eye-opening predictions were made during the event last night, particularly around Holyrood 2026 and what we can expect the Scottish Parliamentary Chamber to look like come May 2026. So without further ado, here is Professor Sir John Curtice and Kevin McKenna.
It's been a pretty eventful day. If people haven't seen the news, Kate Forbes has announced that she will be stepping down this year, next year for Holyrood 2026, Deputy First Minister. Quite a blow for the SNP to lose such a force. John, turning to yourself first, what do you make of her leaving the party, and will this have any impact on the SNP come results day for 2026?
I'm not sure how it impact on results day, but I think one should say, irrespective of your partisan preference, Kate Forbes is undoubtedly one of the most talented politicians within the current Holyrood Parliament. She, of course, earned her spurs on the day when she had to fill in for a suddenly resigned finance minister, present a budget, and she managed to survive that. But I think it so happens that during the course of the last year, Kate and I have been roped in to talk to much the same meeting. And it was perfectly clear what she was doing. So, as many of you may know, she gave an interview some while ago, where she basically explained how she is mixing having a young child with living 4 hours away by car from her place of employment. And she made, I think it's a very clear personal decision. She made a personal decision that she wanted to be with her child every day, whenever possible. And so basically what she was doing when she was we know that therefore she was driving from Skye to Edinburgh and back every week. That's a big thing to do with a relatively young child. But also, if she was speaking at an evening meeting, she would turn up and she would do the speaking and talk to people about, but she didn't stay for dinner. She was clearly going back and looking after her child. And she clearly also has this remarkable network of childminders, of people across Scotland who are willing to help her out. So, I think first of all, given that was her personal choice, one has to say that she's made a very substantial sacrifice commitment to do that. Beyond that, one has to say is that some of us are old enough to remember those promises 25 years ago of a family-friendly parliament that would never meet after 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But we are finding that she's not the only person who has found it difficult to combine parenthood with having young children. And I think, to that extent at least, I think there is the message to the Parliament. We should be reflecting back on whether or not it's going to make it possible for people with young children, particularly those MSPs who are representing the more far-flung parts of this country, to be able to remain. Beyond that, I think I would simply say I would hope that maybe, assuming she doesn't have any other children, and who knows what her plans are in that regard, but her child is currently 3, maybe when she's 13, hopefully maybe Kate Forbes will be back, and certainly I think Scottish politics will be better if that were to be the case. Otherwise, clearly, of course, she's a somewhat controversial figure inside the SNP. Her relatively socially conservative views on various social issues became focused in the leadership campaign. While she is a member of the We Frees, that's you should be surprised if somebody belongs to that group. And she's also, relatively speaking, right of centre on economic issues. And again, certainly not in the same camp as the Sturgeon end of the SNP. But at the same time, very much somebody who, despite her kind of slightly pro-business centre-right outlook, is also still very clearly committed to greater equality in Scotland. So I think I would just simply basically express a non-partisan note of regret that she is not going to be in that parliament next year. Of course, she would potentially be facing quite a difficult contest to retain her seat, but that's another whole story.
Yeah, with the Lib Dems doing
The Lib Dems are probably thinking their chances of regaining that seat have just improved.
They're seeing it as their top target seat.
Yeah.
Kevin, what do you make of Kate Forbes stepping down away from frontline politics?
I think, I won't be too controversial here, but I think the last reason for the SNP just got to the building. I think
In what way? Why do you think?
I think for those of us who went back to independence, or who it was those who came of age, I can put it like that, we've kind of seen the main vehicle for independence, the SNP, being hauled out by single interest groups, cultural identity groups, and there's been more than a suspicion that independence, the whole of independence, has been basically exploited as a means to improve pension laws. And you have Kate Forbes, who's far and away brightest, most particularly, most eloquent, MSP, certainly in the MSP, certainly in the SNP, probably for this political generation. And I know she was very kind and very circumspect in what she said when she, in her resignation email speech. But there's no doubt that I spent the best part of a day with her a couple of years ago, 6 weeks after she had taken part in the leadership contest with Hamza Yusuf. And I've been around newspapers, journalism, over the years than I can remember. And politics can be brutal, so can journalism. I've never seen the level of personal vindictiveness aimed at her by personal party colleagues who all knew what her views were, they all knew that she was a member of the Free Church of Scotland, and they all knew that the 4 years she spent as finance minister, and as John said, that was a very demanding brief. She was brought in as a very young woman to rescue the party and give it some credibility in a brief, you'll remember, where they lost a few votes during the referendum. They did not cover themselves as glory over and yet they turned on her.
She was given such a senior role, such as Deputy First Minister. You could argue that was an award for her talents.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And when I spoke to her, I was struck by how little bitterness there was about that, about what she had to endure. And she almost kind of recognised kindness. And she said, well, the best way to know that with all this abuse that she had, she knew who was out to get her. Is to smile, to be helpful, to be cooperative, to their faces, to eventually break them down because they realise that people have an agenda, they know what our treatment is. You are prepared to forgive and move on. The method, the SNP, especially under Alexander, went to portray itself as a big tent organisation. It's how they got a lot of votes from Labour, that they were a bit more kind, they were a bit more family friendly. And she just thought by channeling that, despite the abuse that she got from the party, that it would break down opposition. But I don't think it happened. I think latterly, right now, I think she's become a marginalised figure within the party, which is a shame. And it shows a disturbing pattern because over the last 5 years, some of the writers, the most talented women, for one reason or another, have been forced out of that party. And if we were going to have a, well, I can't see a referendum that we get it, I don't think, but if I'm wrong and there was to be a second one, and people like her and Joanna Jett and John McKenna and Ashley, several others, who should be in fighting for it, they should be in television screens, they should have a profile, they should be in charge of significant briefs, they should be able to be in a position to show floating voters or undecideds. We can be masters of big responsibilities. You can't do that. You can't have chasing out some of the most talented, some of the most gifted.
Well,
I mean, I guess one other implication we should probably be open about is that her decision probably makes now even more likely that Stephen Flynn
yes.
will be the next leader of the SNP, assuming he manages to get in. And I mean, I think, I don't necessarily agree with anything Kevin said, but I think certainly what one should acknowledge is that, well, no, but I mean, certainly what is true, the group of senior SNP parliamentarians who made it to Holyrood in 1999 was an unusually talented group of people. You know, Sweeney, Salmon, Sturgeon, Kenny McCaskill, the guy who used to be the former General Secretary, who's never got at the moment. I mean, there were about 7 or 8 of them. And the truth is that when they came into government in 2007, the view of civil servants in private was, these guys are quite good. Right? And the truth is that the SNP have not been able to replace that generation with another generation of equal talent. I mean, there are 1 or 2 in the cabinet, like Barry McCallum and people talk about. Stephen Flynn will be there, and we should recognise Stephen Flynn's talents. I mean, many people would say that Stephen Flynn was the best performer at PMQs at Westminster in the last parliament, better than Sunak, better than Starmer, better than Davey. You know, obviously he's upset a few people as well along the way. The SNP do have to worry about collectively the amount of high-profile, you know, A-class talent that they've got, and you know, again, we'll wait to see what they get in terms of new MSPs.
High-profile women as well. We've seen the loss of Nicola Sturgeon,
Sure.
Shona Robeson. You mentioned Mary McCallum and Stephen Flynn. Is it looking like it will be a contest between the 2 of them now for successive leadership?
It might be. I think before we would have said this came forward against Stephen Flynn.
I think I'm hearing from the SNP that Mary McCallum is the favourite child, so to speak. I agree with you about Stephen Flynn. I like Stephen Flynn. I interviewed him last year, and he's a hard bastard.
Sure. But he has the same talent as Kate Forbes to speak extensively, and he can respond to what's said to him. So unlike most people in PMQs, Flynn's second question was often clearly framed on the cuff in response to the answer he got from Sunak, and that is a rare talent.
And the way he, I'm just going to say, gained leadership of the Westminster Group. Didn't gain it, he just seized it. I mean, it was a coup.
Sure.
And the Blackford and his colleagues just didn't see it coming. I mean, literally, it was in the best traditions of like 1930s, 1940s brutality in politics, and it happened overnight, and they didn't, you know, their feet didn't touch the ground, and suddenly he was in. So yeah, because of that, and Blackford still has a certain amount of influence in the party, he hasn't forgiven Stephen Flynn for that, despite, you know, the pictures that you'll see of them. And there's another cohort who liked Blackford, or who, you know, who thrived with Blackford's patronage, who would be against him. And also this...
Who's that, Kevin? Who do you think?
I was going to say. You just have to look, you know. I mean, there's quite a few of them at Westminster, but also there's others who just think that Stephen, because he's hard, because he's uncompromising, because he's very sure of himself, and also this notion that he was parachuted in as somehow the incumbent in that seat, which was just elbowed out the way, would probably favour Mary McCallan if there was a face-off. But to come back to Kate Forbes is 35, her daughter's 3, and John's right that the family means a lot to her. The circumstances of her own family and the way that she was brought up is very important. But by the time her daughter, if she were to go to university or whatever, happens, Kate Forbes will still be this side of 50. And by then, I think the SNP will be out of power by then. If not exactly at that time, then they'll have had a period of power. It'll have washed out, I think, a lot of the bad actors that are currently in the SNP. And I think if Kate Forbes wanted to come back in, she would be welcomed. She would get a better welcome than she would if she were doing that now. The SNP will have learned their lessons about why they keep losing these talented women and the sort of bad actors that have been responsible for it. And I don't think we've seen the last of it. But yeah, Stephen Flynn, slight favourite, but I think Mary McCallan has been worked from the back to go ahead, and even if she's reluctant to, I think there'll be various people who will be like, stop Stephen Flynn at all costs.
But I think it's fair to say she still has yet to prove herself.
Oh yeah,
She's relatively low profile.
Yeah.
Pick up on your bad actors thing later on, Kevin, as I'm keen to see who you might define as that. But I guess I just want to look at...
There's more trouble than I already have.
It's my duty. So I guess, John, just turning to the polls at the moment, give us if you can, a brief rundown of how all the main political parties are faring at the moment. What are the trends looking like?
Well, I mean, the headline is this: that nobody is where they would like to be. But that still leaves the SNP in a much more fortunate position than does the Labour Party. Of course, many of you will remember in the immediate wake of Labour's quite remarkable success last year. In fact, Scotland was the only place in the country where Labour really did come back with any degree of strength. People were saying, well, it's obvious that Anna Sarwar is heading towards Big House. And at the time, some of us went, well, you do realise he's going to have to fight the election in the middle of a UK Labour government term. And you do realise, don't you, that the UK Labour government has, and I'm not necessarily endorsing claims about billions of quid not being accounted for, but it was perfectly obvious, leaving that aside, that it's a very, very difficult inheritance because basically, the UK is struggling to achieve economic growth, like much of the so-called advanced economies in the wake of the financial crash. We maxed out our credit card during the COVID pandemic. Public spending and taxation are both heading are either at or heading for record highs, yet public services are not working, both north and south. So this is a pretty fundamental problem with everybody working economy. And their success UK-wide last year was very, very thin. Very little enthusiasm, very low share of the vote. Starmer's never been a popular politician. But I have to admit, not even I expected them to lose ground quite so quickly. But the result is, of course, Labour's success last year north of the border was essentially off the back of, well, when you're disappointed with the SNP, so you need to vote for us to send a message to Edinburgh. And we know you hate the Tories, so you need to vote for us to make sure they don't get in. The psephology of the second statement was debated, but anyway. But the problem immediately, of course, is that it's very much a negative vote. The moment they were in charge, and given that disappointment with the UK Labour government sitting very, very quickly, basically the Labour Party, all of the revival, that, by the way, primarily border, but because it went south of the border, the roots of the rising scores Labour Party are one party gain to the Liz Truss fiscal event, exactly the same events that laid the groundwork for Labour across the UK as a whole. They're back down to 20% on average in the opinion polls, which is basically where they were in 2021, right? Now, the SNP are basically, well, they're running on average at 33% of the constituency vote, 29% on this vote. This is way down on where they were in 2021, when they got 47% of the vote. They're only very slightly on the 30% they got last year. So you might be asking, so why is it that the SNP's prospects now look to be more good? Well, the answer is because of the collapse of Labour, and because the rise of reform north of the border has fractured the unionist vote. And then you have to remember the crucial thing about the single member party electoral system. That's the first past the post bit of the Holyrood election, which is 73 of the 129 seats. It's not how many votes you've got, it's how many votes you've got relative to your opponents. And the point is that at the moment, the SNP are running on average, 13 points ahead of their nearest rivals, which are the Labour Party on the constituency vote. That does therefore mean, given that the SNP's votes are relatively geographically evenly spread, that they've got a pretty good chance of mopping up the vast bulk of the first past the post seats. So doing virtually no better than last year, when the SNP suffered a serious rebuff, at the moment leaves them with the prospect of still being the largest party in Holyrood. That said, even on an optimistic reading of what that might mean in terms of seats, 55 is probably the best they would get. So that means they will be even more of a minority position now at the moment. And actually you can very quickly see how if their vote falls more heavily in places where they're previously strongest, and some of that happened last year, that number could go below 50 quite rapidly. So they could find themselves still in office, but no longer in power. Right? That's difficult. Meanwhile, Reform Reform are not as popular north of the border as they are south of the border. But look, if Reform are running at 30% as they still are in the polls south of the border, don't be surprised that they're running just over 15% north of the border. And given the Holyrood electoral system, that 16 seats relatively straightforwardly. The Conservatives are being had for mincemeat, as they are south of the border. They're running now at around 10, 11, 12% of the vote. A lot of their votes being taken by Reform. The other parties actually do look as though they're going to be in a strong position of the Democrats. They do now look as though they might return as being something of a presence. But the truth is, you look at all of that, and essentially the fundamental message of the opinion polls is that although there is a lot of discontent with the record of the SNP in government, most of the people who were still ready to vote for the SNP last year are still relatively happy. Whereas a large chunk of the folk who voted Labour last year are not happy with the UK Labour government. They are, on average, giving them a negative reading. So the point, therefore, is that unless the perceptions of the UK Labour government improve, it's very difficult to see how anybody other than the SNP can form a government. The crucial question is, how much of a minority is it, and will there or will there not? And this is very much on the edge of possibilities, whether there is or is not still a pro-independence majority in Holyrood. That cannot be ruled out. That matters because if you don't have an independence majority in Holyrood, there's no way you can have a referendum. If you've got a pro-independence majority in Holyrood, if the SNP were to have leverage in a hung parliament after 2029, then it's potentially game on, even potentially in the left.
Thank you very much for that, John. That was very
I think the point is, we got a discussion at the moment about independence and about strategy. Just two observations. One is that whole conversation inside the SNP about let's make the election a de facto referendum. By 2021, people in voting were already voting in elections as though it was a de facto referendum. The problem for the SNP is that they've now lost the support of some of the people who still say they would vote yes. But they never needed to say that. We were already there. Politics in Scotland were like politics in Northern Ireland. The constitutional question was dominating. So to that extent, at least. But you know, the second thing to say is that I've always taken the view that the realpolitik of another independence referendum at any point in the immediate future, it lies in the outcome of a Westminster election where you've got a lot of SNP MPs, where basically you won't necessarily get the referendum straight away, but you need to remember the history of the 1974 to 1979 Parliament. You end up with a minority government that is deeply unpopular in the polls, doesn't want to face the electorate, and at that point you've got to start bargaining with other people in the Parliament to avoid a vote of no confidence. And here at this point we should now give due credit to Liz Truss for what she achieved in her 40 or so days as Prime Minister. What she achieved was she saved the Union. Because until Liz Truss's fiscal event, it looked as though we're heading for a home parliament in which the SNP might well have had leverage. Liz Truss killed that. Liz Truss was actually the SNP's biggest problem in the whole argument about independence.
That's a really interesting statement. I guess from that...
Well, we should give credit where credit's due, right?
Well done, Liz Truss. So we're also kind of in the backdrop of John Swinney recently announcing that to get independence, to have a mandate for independence, the SNP, according to him, would need to win a majority of seats. John, do you think that is in any way possible from what you're seeing?
The answer is that it looks extremely unlikely, but I mean, Brian Taylor's in the column in the Herald on Saturday, I recommend it to everybody. What is John Swinney doing? He's saying to people, if you want independence, vote SNP. Don't vote for Alva, don't vote for the Greens. Now, the argument side of the SNP is, no, we should say that getting a majority of the votes on the list vote. No. John Swinney doesn't want there to be a fragmented list vote. He wants people to vote for the SNP, and the challenge facing the SNP, because the other thing one needs to understand about politics in Scotland is that the thing that hasn't changed in the turbulence of the last 2.5 years is the level of support for independence. We are still basically divided 50-50 on the independence question. Very few, although you hear a lot of talk about people not being concerned about independence anymore, and it's gone off the boil, just tell that to most unionist voters. Most unionist voters are still deeply concerned about independence. Very few people now are willing to vote for the SNP if they're opposed to independence. That is a complete contrast to the position in 2011 when the SNP got over a majority. You then had about 40% of people who believed in devolution but not independence voting for the SNP. Those days are over. So the SNP are picking up very little on the no side of the argument. Their problem is they've only got about 3/5 of the people who currently say they would vote yes, saying they would vote for them. And John Swinney basically is going to get up from the third of the voters they've currently got. His obvious target audience are people who said they were in favour of independence but are not currently minded to vote for the SNP. That's his target group. He therefore needs to try and make it A, clear to them that if they want independence they need to vote for the SNP, and B, he doesn't want them voting for anybody else. Of course, it also does have, his stance does also have the advantage that should he perchance succeed, he can cite precedent.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And having, in a sense, campaigned on the basis of the majority, and then he could go to Keir Starmer and say, no, David Cameron said that was enough. No, I think the honest truth is that even if Swinney were to succeed, unlikely as that currently seems, we still wouldn't get a referendum, but it does potentially provide the SNP with what the task they really face. The task the SNP really face, as does the Border Nationalist movement, is to get the numbers in favour of independence up from 50% to 60%. Because the brutal truth about referendums is you should only really call them when you know what the result's going to be. And the problem is for both Unionists and Nationalists in Scotland is that none of us know what the result would be. So it's a bad idea to hold a referendum until one side or the other has clearly acquired an advantage. And no, that's not.
I just don't think that. I don't think the SNP will ever. I don't think any independent supporter will ever be in a position where they can guarantee the outcome of another referendum. I think Swinney uses that. I mean, this year it's what, 60%. A couple of years ago it was 56, 57 they were saying. There was even a figure a few weeks ago that it would have to be up to 70. You touched on something a few minutes ago where you were talking about in terms of how many seats the SNP could get if they win, could they get it to a pro-independence majority. Now I know a lot of that will be determined by how many Greens get in and what sort of relationship they have with the Greens. I see another degree of jeopardy for the SNP in that prior to 2014, and I probably fell into this category, there was, depending on who you believe or what you read, up to 30% of Labour voters prior to 2014 either voted for independence or at the very least were intending to vote, and that quite a lot of them stayed with the SNP, especially in 2015 when they were having around. But a lot of these people, and I know a lot of these people, one of the reasons that they did vote for the SNP is because they thought they actually could gain independence. They thought they had the people in the party and policies in which they could be confident, and they kind of sparked their imagination, they captured them. Now, these were people who you wouldn't call ardent nationalists. A lot of them were people who thought, they'd no time for the SNP, but they thought, this is our one and only chance to have the closest thing to like a socialist republic, where we can reset British politics, and in our country we can bring in socialist values, or at least left of centre values, and then we can just get rid of the SNP. Thank you very much, away you go, and then we can have a proper red and tooth for Labour, left-wing Labour government. Yeah, I know it's quite extreme, right, but I cling on to that. But that's gone now because there is a serious credibility factor with the SNP and its relationship to independence. I'm not convinced that the SNP are serious about independence, apart from it being something that they would chuck in a few weeks before an election, as they do. You look at all the social media accounts prior to election, they light up with the word independence, self-determination. When it's been dormant for a few years because they don't want to scare the horses, but all of a sudden there are votes to be had. It's like prior to 2007, the Labour Party in Scotland didn't see the SNP coming, in 2011 as well. And they had a cohort of MPs who would turn up on the streets of their constituency a few weeks prior to the count and just expect to get in. And they usually did. Only this time they'd seen the electoral machine of the SNP, which was beginning to show its claws, and the work that they were doing. They just didn't see it coming. Now what we're seeing is that the Labour Party, when I saw how they operated at the recent Hamilton Mark Stonehouse by-election, it's quite obvious that they had learned a lot of lessons from that. Jackie Bailey, who I was speaking to last week, said they were virtually living there for 6 months prior to it. And I also think the Labour Party are more alive to the threat of reform. And what John had said, that there's they have completely more or less destroyed a large group of Conservative vote.
Yeah,
but Labour, a lot of Labour voters that I saw on those streets, because I shadowed the reform people simply because I was curious as to why working class trade unionists and Labour people were backing this party, led by Farage. And what I saw scared me. I saw committed trade unionists and Labour people who were so sickened and felt so marginalised by the political process in Scotland and by some of these bad actors, mainly in the SNP but also in the Labour Party, had no confidence in them, felt targeted by them. There's only so many times that you can stand being called a bigot when you know you're not, when you say, you know what, well maybe we'll just vote for the party that speaks our language.
Because we've spoken about bad actors quite a lot, you've spoken about bad actors quite a lot. Can you define what a bad actor is?
Good question. I would say that half the cabinet is. I'd say that John Swinney is. In the context of the SNP, first it's people who purport to be pro-independence and aren't.
So careerists, is that?
Yeah, well up to a point, because, John probably knows this better than me, but there is an element, there's quite an element of careerism within professional frontline politics. We get that.
You mean that politicians wish to get elected, Kevin?
Well, politicians wish to kind of get elected, and quite a lot of them get the sort of salaries that their skill set would never ever be able to command in City Street. and the pension pots that go with it. But from the SNP perspective, it's people, I think, who have exploited the independence bandwagon, especially post-2015. I don't know if any of you remember 2015, but Nicola and the SNP were holding rock shows. These weren't just party conferences, they were absolute rock shows, and they would have this big counter on the stage where it would be counting how many new members they'd had in the space of a speech. The euphoria was off the scale. That's not there now.
Sure. And Johnson is not the person who's ever
I know, honest John, I mean, if you saw that counter behind John, you'd be going, how many zeros is it?
I guess an issue that's been brought up in all the conversations that we've had so far is leadership. We've kind of been left uncertain, unsure of who is going to come in place of John Swinney. John Swinney's own leadership, how long will it last? I mean, John, how is the leadership playing out? How is the leadership question playing out in polls? Do people find that the SNP is a very unstable party at the moment?
Not particularly. I did some digging before coming here. Swinney's numbers have been kind of stable since he became First Minister. But he's not, because Ipsos used to ask about him when he was Deputy First Minister, he's not as popular now as he was when he was Deputy First Minister. And I think, the truth is, however, in an era of fragmented politics, in which there are no really popular politicians, that's still potentially good. That's still good enough to make him the least unpopular politician in Scotland, right?
How does that feel for other political
because Annas is suffering from the shadow of Starmer. Starmer is deeply unpopular. Kelly Baslock, who is she, and Farage is very strongly popular amongst a section of the Scottish and British society, but that's still tends to be the negative territory. But there's a broader question here. There is a problem of leadership. It's not confined to the SNP. Right? And I think one of the reasons I'll point out myself deeply unpopular, but here goes. One of the reasons, if you go just think about the last Westminster election, Rishi Sunak. Well, tries hard, but think about the last 12 months in government. They pulled this lever, they pulled that lever, they pulled that lever, and they discovered there was nothing else behind any of these levers. You know, cutting taps, trying to stop the boats. But the fundamental problem was these were all individual tactics. There was no strategy. Keir Starmer, brilliant prosecution lawyer, but we have to remember that the prosecution lawyers don't write their own brief. Somebody writes the brief for them, which they then prosecute. Starmer has never, again, managed to come up with a story or a narrative about what he and his government are about, which is one of the reasons why you get this sense of lack of direction, particularly when there are changes in policy position. Everybody does a good splash, but again, what's the broad message? John Swinney, I think undoubtedly he's much more self-confident, he's much more relaxed in himself than he was 20 years ago when he was previously leader. You know, he could steady the boat, but again, you know, your complaint is, you know, what's it all about, where's it going? Now, Nigel Farage can do this. Nigel Farage can do broad synoptic messaging. And in particular, he is we're talking about a deeply pessimistic electorate. We're talking about electorate across the UK. That basically, far too many people say to themselves, how am I going to feed my kids this evening? And if I fall ill, will the NHS manage to deal with me in time? These are the two fundamental aims of our society, right? Farage is absolutely brilliant at articulating that concern, and in so doing, what he's essentially done is he's got the body of people who voted for Brexit, and they're now voting for Farage. Or another way of putting it, when Farage stood down all his candidates for the Brexit Party in 2019, they basically went to Johnson. Johnson got his majority. If I tell you that support for reform amongst people who are voting Leave in 2016 is currently standing at over 50% across the UK as a whole, and it's over 40% in Scotland, then you're in. So Farage can articulate that deep-seated concern, and then he's able to channel it into concerns about migrants, about net zero, about equalities policy, all these culture wars issues, and that's why he is where he is. But the point is, Farage does leadership. All right? You may not like it, you may not like the direction in which he's trying to take people, and some people do, but the point is, you know what he stands for. People say they know what Farage stands for, they don't know what any of these other people actually believe. And the question is, who is out there that's going to be able to do this in future? Right? And in the end, when we talk about whether it's Mary McCann or Stephen Flynn or whatever, a fundamental thing is, can the SNP find somebody who can match Farage in the ability to construct a synoptic vision and a narrative about what the SNP and the independence movement is about? Because that ultimately, I think that's fundamentally your complaint.
Yeah, if you go back to period 2011 and 20, Alex Salmond was Scotland's Alex Salmond for comparing him to Farage, but he had the charisma, he had the vision, he was trained in the vision, he developed the vision, an entire generation, and he was taking people with him, and he was appealing across a broad swathe of Scottish society. We were talking about this earlier. You know, Alex Salmond could go on to a bin workers picket line and have them stamping their feet and cheering for him. And within 2 hours he could be at a Federation of British Industry dinner and have them doing the same. And so when he called the referendum, remember he outflanked David Cameron, who was a very, very bright individual. He outflanked him in 2013 in terms of the referendum. He brought an awful lot of people with him because he had the charisma, because he had people knew he believed it. You have to actually believe, and you know what it's like when you see people on television, whether it's in politics, whether it's in sport, you know instinctively who believes it. Even if you don't agree with them, you know that and they might not be the most articulate, but you know that they believe it. My issue with the SNP is that I just don't think they have the heart for independence. I think that there's a way of selling an independent Scotland, especially in Europe, because, quite apart from getting a majority of pro-independence MSPs, which I think is beyond them in 2026, if they were to, they then have to sell it to Europe. They have to sell it to international partners. They have to sell it to international investors. And this is where I think that losing this pattern of losing very, very talented people in the party who can speak eloquently with international statespeople, who have got respect at Westminster across the parties, who can give the concept, the very notion of independence a patina of respect, being taken seriously, is invaluable. It's not there at the moment. And much as though, I admire Stephen Flynn, I think he would be an effective leader. Effective isn't going to cut it, because unlike all the other parties competing with him in 2026, the SNP have got two missions. One immediately is to gain government, and then the second, as they keep telling us, with their main raison d'etre is to sell independence. That's not happening, and I don't see anybody in that party who's capable, anywhere near capable of doing what Alex Salmond did, or, to back to what John was saying, who have any essence of the vision and the sense of purposefulness that Nigel Farage has.
Just want to turn to John for a few predictions before we go to Q&As. I guess first off on the independence question, with the trying to win a pro-independence majority at Holyrood, John, we know that the Greens have past been partners with the SNP, but is there a chance that the Lib Dems could also come in?
There are two separate questions. There's the question of who might help to sustain a minority SNP administration, and some of us remember fondly the days when Annabel Goldie played aunt to the rather naughty nephew she had in the former Life of Salmon. The Conservative parties basically sustained that administration through budgets, though that's now inconceivable. But maybe the Lib Dems might be willing to do that. Question mark. But that's a separate question. But the Lib Dems are never going to vote for independence, whereas the Greens potentially will. So the point is that you need to have the 65 votes in Holyrood for people who will be willing to pass a referendum bill should you ever be given the powers to do so. And that's why it matters, right? Leaving aside the question of governmental formation.
And then just looking, I know it's so hard to predict at this moment in time, but do you have any predictions as to how May 2026 will look like in terms of seat projections for each party?
Oh gosh, that's asking a great deal of detail.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, you're pushing your luck there. I will say what I think I already said this evening.
Do you think Reform will get any double figures?
Yeah, unless let me pick that up first. So, Reform are now running. Reform are exploiting a niche market. It's very, very much a niche market. My guess has been for some time is that the maximum size of that niche market south of the border is about 30%, which is where they're at. But the thing to realise is that if Reform remain ahead in the polls for another month or two, there will be no argument that this is the longest ever time at which a party other than Conservative Labour has been ahead in the UK by polls. And if Reform can sustain that kind of support, then double figures in terms of seats in Scotland and in terms of votes should be relative child's play. But even if they fall back to the 25% or so that they were before the English local elections, unless there is a sudden, resurrection. I think Kevin McKenna's becoming more effective slowly as a leader, but it's very much a work in progress. But the problem the Tories face is that Reform are not just taking voters; they're taking donors and they're taking people. One briefing I heard is that a majority of the people who were elected as Reform councillors down south at the beginning of May are former members of the Conservative Party. And it's just sucking in the lifeblood, the things that keep you going when you're in opposition. I've almost managed to avoid your question, but I will. I think the answer to it is it's very difficult at the moment to see any outcome other than the SNP still providing government, respectively of government. What remains highly uncertain is how strong it will be. It could be as low as 45 seats. I think the maximum at the moment is around 55 or so they're probably going to be weaker than at the moment. But 55 seats you only got to find one party probably to be able to make a deal. 45 you've probably got to find two and life becomes much more difficult. So I think that's where the room for manoeuvre is. I think at the moment it's a race between Reform and Labour as to who comes second. And unless the popularity of the UK Labour government improves, Labour may find themselves in much the same position as they are at the moment. And that's as far as I'm willing to go.
You mentioned the successes of Greens, Lib Dems,
Well, the Greens don't seem to have lost out from being in coalition. They don't seem to have lost out from falling out from the coalition. They're running, somewhere around 9-10% of the vote, and therefore should presumably at least be at least the current size. It's the Lib Dems who do seem to, frankly they should be because they're in a very weak position. But they do seem to be it's not just on the constituency vote, obviously their vote's very, very concentrated, but they're running about 10% on the list on a very consistent basis, so they should be able to top up and 2 seats there. So, last time they fell below the threshold to be a recognised party, but this time they look as they should make it. And that does mean that they may well play an important brokerage role in the next parliament.
Plenty of time for disaster success to occur.
Yeah, the other thing I should say, that, the lesson of the last Westminster Parliament is do not presume that the outcome of the last election is going to determine what happens in the next one. The Conservative Party was never behind in the UK-wide opinion polls for the first 2 years. All went division.
Thank you very much both for your insight and analysis. Now to turn to audience questions. I'm so sorry, I'm having difficulty seeing everyone, but if you've got a question, please raise your hand. Yes. And could you stand up as well? Sorry, I know it's a wee bit like a public speaking event.
Sorry.
One thing that was in the headlines recently was the promotion of ITV and YouTube in terms of what the most watched channels were. So BBC, YouTube, ITV, a lot of talented journalists in ITV or ITV might have particularly thought this is part of the rise of Reform or similar parties where
Okay, so although yeah, sure. So the question essentially was, what do we make of the fact that according to Ofcom's most recent report last week, that more people now watch YouTube than watch ITV? Okay. It so happened I had to write about funding the BBC, so I was all over these off-common points. The first thing to say, of course, is that actually you can watch BBC on YouTube. You can watch ITV on YouTube. These things get rebroadcast. So to that extent, at least, and so that's point one. Point two, of course, my wife these days is a full-time priest in the Episcopal Church, and she, like many churches now, they live stream their stuff over YouTube, right? So I think there's a small question here. I mean, of course, what is true, you can now watch YouTube on your smart telly, and to that extent, at least, it looks like the same thing. But I mean, I think probably the function within the media environment of YouTube is rather different from that of ITV, let alone the BBC. So that's point one. More broadly, what I would say to you, one of the things I have done recently is some work on the relationship between social media and people's attitudes. Two headlines. One is that actually, while you can find evidence that people who get their news primarily via social media are more polarised on cultural issues, they're not necessarily more polarised on economic issues, and that therefore the impact, the extent to which social media encourages polarisation seems to depend on the subject, and it's an interesting question as to why that might be true of culture wars issues and not on economic issues. But the second thing to say is that it was the case in 2024, that's the data I was using, that people who follow the news on social media were more likely to vote Green. In itself, not entirely surprising, because people who follow the news on social media, it's a big generational divide, right? But even actually allowing for that, the support for the Greens was particularly high, but also rather more likely to vote for reform. So certainly people who follow the news on social media, which I know is not the same thing as YouTube, seem to be rather more likely to vote.
And that's all we've got time for on today's episode, but this is not the last of Unspun live at the Fringe, far from it. Tomorrow we'll be hearing from broadcasting expert Brian Taylor, who is having a sit-down chat with the First Minister John Swinney. The day after that, we will hear Anna Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, make his case during what's going to be a pretty grilling interview from our editor, Catherine Salmond. And then after that, on Thursday, we'll be hearing from Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes, who's just announced that she will be stepping down and won't seek re-election come Holyrood 2026. She'll be put in the hot seat for what's geared up to be a pretty close and revealing interview with our political editor, Andrew Learmonth. So loads to gain from that, so please don't miss out and keep on listening and subscribing to the Herald's Unspun Live Politics podcast.